After 10 long years, I finally returned home. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The moment I stepped inside, my entire family froze. Their smiles disappeared and their faces turned pale as if they'd seen a ghost. What happened next changed my life forever. Stay with me till the end, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon for more unbelievable life stories like this. It's strange how certain memories stay lodged in your brain for years, refusing to fade, even when they don't seem all that significant on the surface. This one has been sitting with me for over a decade now. Sometimes it pops up when I'm boarding a plane, sometimes when I see someone pulling a passive aggressive stunt, and sometimes, like today, when I watched a small spat between two strangers over a seat. That incident dragged me right back to October 2013. I was 27 at the time, still fresh in my career, still trying to find my footing in an industry where appearances mattered just as much as talent, maybe even more. I was working for a mid-sized tech company based in Chicago, and we were flying out to San Francisco for an annual convention. It wasn't just any convention, this was Tech Vision 2013, one of those big events where CEOs, investors, engineers, and even journalists mingled under one roof, showing off products and making connections that could change careers overnight. I wasn't anyone special back then, a rookie, the kind of guy who double-checked his emails 3 times before hitting send, who rehearsed his elevator pitch in the mirror just in case some big name asked what I did. I had only been with the company for 11 months, and this was my first major trip representing us. My two senior colleagues, Mark Reynolds and Susan Lee, were both seasoned pros who had been attending Tech Vision for years. Mark was the extroverted type, always laughing too loudly, always shaking hands with someone he knew from back in the day. Susan was quieter, sharper, one of those people whose approval you silently craved but rarely received. I remember being nervous even before we got to the airport. The night before, I'd stayed up late scrolling through LinkedIn, Googling the keynote speakers, and overthinking what I'd wear. The company wasn't paying for first-class seats, obviously, but we weren't flying budget either. United Airlines, Economy Plus, so at least we had a bit of extra legroom. I figured I'd try to relax on the flight, maybe review my notes, maybe chat a little with Mark and Susan to seem less green. The airport was chaos that morning. You could tell half the people at O'Hare International were heading to the same convention. I recognized company logos on laptop bags, overheard snippets of tech jargon in conversations, even spotted a couple of faces I'd seen on panel lineups online. Everyone seemed to know someone. I didn't know anyone except Mark and Susan, and even they seemed busy exchanging hellos with acquaintances every few steps as we made our way down the jet bridge. I trailed a few paces behind them, clutching my boarding pass like it was a lifeline, trying not to look like the rookie I was. My seat was 21B, an aisle seat, not bad. Mark and Susan had snagged seats across the aisle from each other, a row or two ahead, so I was on my own. That was fine. I kind of liked the idea of having time to myself before the whirlwind of the convention began. I still remember the smell of recycled air hitting my face as I stepped onto the plane, the muffled beeps of boarding passes scanning in the background, the rustling of jackets being stuffed into overhead bins. People were still settling in, lining up in the aisle, balancing coffee cups while juggling backpacks and headphones. There was that strange energy in the cabin, part impatience, part exhaustion, part anticipation. That's when I saw her. She was sitting in my seat. At first I thought I must have misread my boarding pass. I glanced down 21, except there she was, comfortably planted, oversized sunglasses covering half her face, chunky studio headphones clamped over her ears, hands folded neatly in her lap like some sort of performance piece on how to ignore the world. Her head was tilted back against the headrest, chin slightly raised, lips parted just enough to suggest she was either asleep or doing an extremely convincing impression of someone who was. The aisle around us was starting to fill up, and a few people were already glancing over as if silently urging me to keep moving. But I froze there for a moment, processing. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was in the wrong row by accident. Maybe she'd wake up, apologize, and move. Simple misunderstanding, right? Wrong. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to invade her space, and said, "Excuse me." No reaction. I tried again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I reached out and gave her shoulder the lightest tap imaginable, like I was afraid she might shatter if I used too much force. No response. Behind me, I could feel the impatience of the people waiting to get past me, the unspoken pressure building. I tapped again, this time a little firmer. Nothing. It was only when I went for the third tap that she suddenly woke up, her head jerking slightly as though surfacing from some deep, peaceful dream. She didn't take off her sunglasses, she didn't remove her headphones. She just turned her head slightly toward me, gave a small exaggerated yawn, and then, in the most theatrical gesture imaginable, pointed at her headphones and shrugged, palms up, like, "Sorry, I can't hear you." I blinked at her, momentarily stunned by the audacity. "Fine, if we're playing charades, let's play charades." I held up my boarding pass, tapped on the seat number 21B, and gestured toward her, then toward myself. She glanced down at the ticket, exaggerated an "oh" with her lips as if this was breaking news, and then tucked her knees in half an inch and motioned for me to squeeze past her into the middle seat. I hesitated, caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation. She wanted me to climb over her knees, over her carefully constructed bubble of indifference, as though I were the one intruding. I could feel my heart rate pick up, not from anger exactly, but from that awkward tension of not wanting to make a scene while knowing I was about to make one anyway. Mark had glanced back from his seat a couple of rows ahead, raising an eyebrow like, "Everything okay back there?" I gave the smallest shake of my head and turned back to her. This wasn't going to work. I wasn't about to contort myself into the row while the person sitting in my seat pretended not to hear me. I leaned down slightly, lowered my voice but sharpened my tone, and said slowly, clearly, "I need you to move." Of course she kept her headphones on, pretending not to hear a thing. By now the line behind me was stuck. People sighing audibly, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Someone behind me muttered something under their breath, probably cursing me out for holding things up. I felt the pressure building in my chest, that mix of embarrassment and stubbornness, and finally something in me snapped. I raised my voice, not yelling, but loud enough to cut through the chatter in the cabin, and said, "I'm not the one getting in, you are." The effect was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened, her chin dropped slightly, and without another word she swung her legs to the side and slid into the window seat like she'd been planning to move all along. As I sat down, the guy in the aisle behind me gave me a quick thumbs up as he passed. I exhaled, finally letting go of the tension in my chest, and thought, okay, that's over, except it wasn't. Not even close. At that moment I had no idea that this seemingly minor confrontation was about to spiral into a bizarre 6-hour battle of passive aggression, quiet power plays, and unspoken grudges that would stick in my memory for the next 10 years. And honestly, that was just the beginning. The first 20 minutes after I sat down were weird. That's the only way I can describe them. I kept trying to shake off the awkwardness of the encounter, but it lingered, heavy and uncomfortable, like humidity you can't escape. I focused on buckling my seatbelt, pulling out my phone, pretending to scroll through emails I wasn't actually reading. Meanwhile, the woman beside me, the one who had just performed her little asleep with headphones act, remained perfectly still, her head tilted slightly toward the window, sunglasses still on, as if she was starring in her own indie film, where I didn't exist. The only sign of life was the faint tap 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 of her index finger against her thigh, keeping time with whatever she was listening to through those oversized studio headphones. I wasn't angry, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I was trying to act normal, but inside my thoughts were a mess. I kept replaying the scene in my head, how she ignored me, how she forced me to raise my voice, how the people behind us were probably annoyed at me, even though none of it was my fault. I hated feeling like the problem person on a flight, the one holding up the line. The flight attendants did their safety demo, the engines roared, and eventually we lifted off from Chicago, climbing above the quilt of orange streetlights and into the darkness. I stared out the tiny oval window on the opposite side of the aisle, letting my thoughts wander. I was supposed to be thinking about the convention, about the presentations, the networking, how to not sound like an idiot if I ended up in a conversation with someone important. Instead, all I could focus on was this weird
created simmering tension between me and a complete stranger sitting 18 inches away. I thought that would be the end of it. Really, in my head, I pictured her spending the entire flight ignoring me. I'd do the same, and we'd go our separate ways after landing. That's how these little travel awkwardnesses usually go. Awkward silence, then you both move on with your lives. But no, about 45 minutes into the flight, just as I'd started to relax, I felt a light tap on my shoulder, not an aggressive one, not annoyed, polite, almost delicate. I turned my head, and there she was, sunglasses off now, headphones pushed slightly down around her neck. She leaned in slightly, and in this soft, syrupy tone, said, "Hey, if you want, I'd be open to switching seats with you." I blinked at her, caught off guard. My brain scrambled to process what she meant. Switching seats? With me? Why? Glanced quickly at the row. I was in the aisle, she was now in the middle, and there was an empty window seat next to her, so she wanted the aisle back. After making me go through all that to get her out of it, took everything in me to keep my face neutral, but I couldn't help the tiny, incredulous smile tugging at the corner of my lips. I politely declined, saying something like, "I'm good, thanks." I thought that would be it. Surely that would be it, but that wasn't the last I'd hear from her, not by a long shot. I settled back into my seat, trying to focus on my Kindle, but I could feel her glance at me occasionally, like she was waiting for me to change my mind. I ignored it, keeping my eyes glued to the glowing words on the screen, even though I couldn't have told you a single sentence I'd read. About 15 minutes later, I felt another tap on my shoulder. This time, when I turned, she had this deliberately casual smile plastered across her face, the kind of smile that was just a little too practiced to be genuine. Her voice dropped slightly, taking on a quieter, more conspiratorial tone. "Hey, the offer's open for your friends too. If they want to switch seats, I'd be happy to accommodate." My eyebrows rose just a fraction. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about the seat. This was something in her tone, in the way she said, "your friends," made it sound less like she was being generous and more like she was testing me, trying to see if I knew who she was, if I realized how important she thought she was. I gave a polite little chuckle, nodding as I replied, "Sure." Just one word, nothing more. It wasn't enthusiastic, but it wasn't confrontational either. It was neutral, the kind of sure you use when you want to shut down a conversation without seeming rude. But in my head, alarms were going off. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was fishing for validation. She wanted me to offer the seat to Mark and Susan, knowing they were higher up in the company than me. She probably assumed they'd recognize her, or at least care enough to move for her. That's the thing about these conventions. Everyone's trying to flex in subtle ways. Titles, companies, panels, who you know. It's like high school, but with better clothes and more expensive coffee. She clearly expected me to take the bait. She thought I'd rush over to Mark and Susan like an eager intern, tell them someone in the industry wanted to switch, and they'd be impressed by her, maybe even grateful to her, except that's not what happened. The moment she turned back toward the window, I pulled out my phone, slid it under my thigh so she couldn't see the screen, and texted Mark, "Heads up, 21B drama. Woman sitting next to me is playing weird games about switching seats. Don't engage." Mark's reply came almost instantly. "LOL, got it." A minute later I saw Susan glance subtly back at me, then give me the tiniest smirk, before turning forward again. That was it. We were all alone. If this woman wanted to flex some imaginary industry clout, she'd picked the wrong row. I thought ignoring her would end things, but I underestimated how relentless someone can be when their ego gets bruised. An hour later, she tapped me again. Same sugary smile. Same line. "So did you ask them yet?" I forced a light laugh, shook my head, and said, "Not yet." She tilted her head slightly, as if surprised I hadn't rushed to do her bidding. "Well," she said, drawing the word out just enough to make it clear she thought I was missing out on some golden opportunity. 10 minutes passed. Tap again. "Have you had the chance to check with them?" Another fake smile exchange. "Not yet." By the third time, something in me shifted. It stopped being mildly annoying and started feeling absurd. I couldn't believe I was having the same conversation, over and over, with a stranger who seemed convinced she was the center of this 6-hour universe. I caught Mark's eye at one point, and he mouthed, What the hell? I just shook my head, giving him a tiny smile, silently communicating, don't ask, just don't ask. And yet, despite how ridiculous it was, I couldn't fully relax. I spent the next couple of hours in this weird, hyper-aware state, where I was constantly anticipating the next tap on my shoulder. Every time she shifted in her seat, I tensed up, expecting another round. I couldn't sleep, couldn't read, couldn't even focus on the in-flight move. What was her deal? Was this about power? Ego? Was she trying to assert dominance in some subtle psychological way? Or maybe, and this thought struck me somewhere over Nebraska, maybe she really thought she was somebody. By the time the captain announced we were beginning our descent into San Francisco, I was mentally exhausted from the sheer absurdity of it all. I thought I'd handled it well enough, stayed polite, stayed calm, didn't escalate, but there was an edge of unease gnawing at me. Because the way she looked at me, those brief assessing glances behind the sunglasses, the calculated timing of her taps, the insistence despite polite refusals, it all suggested something else. This wasn't over, not for her, and I had no idea why. By the time we touched down at San Francisco International Airport, I was running on fumes. Not physically, I hadn't moved more than a few feet in 6 hours, but mentally I felt like I'd just gone 12 rounds in some invisible fight I never agreed to participate in. The landing itself was smooth, but inside I was tangled up in frustration, disbelief, and this strange gnawing self-consciousness. The woman next to me hadn't said another word after her third attempt at convincing me to ask Mark and Susan about switching seats, but her silence wasn't peaceful. It was calculated. You know how some people can radiate a kind of controlled contempt without speaking? That's exactly what it felt like. She didn't even look at me when we landed, just slipped her sunglasses back on, adjusted her headphones, and pretended to be deeply engrossed in whatever she was listening to, but her tapping finger on her thigh gave her away, keeping rhythm to some imaginary beat. I thought the hard part was over once the wheels touched the runway. I told myself, all right, this is done. You'll grab your bag, you'll meet Mark and Susan at baggage claim, you'll check into the hotel, and you'll never see this woman again. That was the plan, except it didn't quite work out that way. As we shuffled off the plane, I spotted her a few rows ahead in the aisle, pulling out her phone. She had this air of casual self-importance, like someone who expected people to recognize her. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when we finally got into the terminal, I noticed her lingering just a little too long near the exit, glancing back over her shoulder once before disappearing into the crowd. That should have been my first sign this wasn't over. By the time we got to the hotel, it was late afternoon. Mark and Susan wanted to grab an early dinner and prep for the convention kickoff the next morning, but I begged off, claiming I was tired. Really, I just needed space. I needed to decompress, to sit in silence and reset my head before walking into a room full of people who, unlike me, seemed to know exactly where they belonged in this industry. I collapsed onto the bed in my room at the Hilton Union Square, staring at the ceiling for what felt like an hour, trying to process everything. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? A 6-hour Cold War over an airplane seat, with a complete stranger. It shouldn't have gotten under my skin this much. But it did. I kept replaying the moment she tapped my shoulder for the first time after takeoff, that soft syrupy voice, that fake generosity dripping from her tone. It wasn't about kindness, it was about control. The more I thought about it, the more I started piecing together her strategy, the feigned sleep, the refusal to engage, forcing me to raise my voice first, so she could play the victim if she wanted to, then the calculated offers that weren't really offers at all. It was such a subtle performance, but it was deliberate, and I hated how much space it was taking up in my head. The next morning, Tech Vision kicked off at the Moscone Center, and it was immediately overwhelming. Thousands of people in perfectly pressed blazers and bright lanyards streamed through the massive glass doors. Company logos were everywhere. Apple, Google, Microsoft, a dozen startups I'd never even heard of. Everyone seemed to know someone. Everyone seemed to belong. I tried to shake off the leftover unease from the flight, throwing myself into the rhythm of the day. Panel sessions, networking mixers, product demos. Mark was in his element, bouncing between conversations like he'd been rehearsing them for weeks. Susan was more strategic, only speaking to people she knew could actually move the needle for us. I stuck close to them, trying to absorb as much as I could, nodding along, introducing myself when prompted, smiling in all the right places. For the first couple of hours, I managed to forget about the woman from the plane until lunch. The convention center had these open networking areas set up with long tables, the kind where you were expected to sit next to strangers and strike up conversations that could change your career. I grabbed a tray, slid into an empty spot at one of the tables, and started unwrapping my sandwich when I heard it. A laugh. Not just any laugh. Her laugh. I froze for half a second before turning my head, and sure enough, 3 seats down at the very same table, there she was. Oversized sunglasses perched on top of her head this time, headphones around her neck, holding court with a small group of people who clearly knew her or wanted to. I felt my chest tighten immediately. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence that we just ended up at the same table in a sea of thousands of attendees, but the way she glanced sideways at me once, just briefly, then leaned in closer to her group, lowering her voice while still smiling. No, that wasn't random. I busied myself with my food, pretending not to notice her, but my ears betrayed me, catching fragments of her conversation. She was talking about panel invites, name-dropping companies, casually dropping hints about who she worked closely with. The people around her seemed hooked on every word. She had presence, I'll give her that, and maybe that was the point. She was reminding me, without ever speaking to me directly, that she was someone. I hated how much power she still had over me in my own head. That evening back at the hotel bar, Mark and Susan were debriefing over drinks, talking strategy for day 2. I nursed a whiskey I didn't really want, half listening, half scanning the room out of paranoia she'd show up again. Mark eventually leaned back and asked, "You good, man? You've been quiet since we landed." I hesitated before replying, "Yeah, just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was restless. I couldn't shake this creeping sense that the seat incident wasn't just a weird airplane story anymore. It had turned into something big. The way she'd tapped me 3 times, the repeated offers, the smugness in her tone, and now, her conveniently running into me again at lunch. It felt orchestrated. I lay awake that night, staring at the glowing numbers on the hotel alarm clock, replaying every interaction in my head. Was she trying to undermine me somehow? Was she testing me? Was this some bizarre networking tactic? Some power play where she establishes dominance through a dumb little airplane seat dispute? It sounded paranoid even to me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling she wasn't done. And I was right, because the very next day, everything escalated.
The second morning of Tech Vision 2013 felt different. The energy in the air had shifted, or maybe it was just me. I woke up restless, running on 3 hours of sleep, still wound up from the constant loop of overthinking the past 2 days. The flight, the taps on my shoulder, the fake smiles, the carefully placed offers, the way she seemed to orbit around me without ever acknowledging what had happened. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I couldn't be. Mark and Susan were already in the lobby when I came down, sipping overpriced cappuccinos and reviewing the day's schedule. I joined them quietly, trying to act normal, but Susan glanced up briefly, studying me the way she always did. Sharp, quick, like she could see things you didn't want to see. "You good?" she asked simply. I nodded automatically. "Yeah, just tired." She didn't press, but the slight raise of her eyebrow told me she didn't buy it. Day 2 of the convention was packed with back-to-back sessions, panel discussions, and networking breaks that blurred into one another. I tried to lose myself in the busyness, but there was this constant low-level tension simmering beneath the surface, like static in the air before a storm. By mid-morning, it happened again. I just walked out of a keynote about emerging cloud infrastructure trends when I spotted her across the atrium, chatting animatedly with 2 executives from a well-known startup. Same oversized sunglasses perched on her head, same confident body language, same easy laugh that carried just far enough for people to notice. And then she saw me. For the briefest moment, our eyes locked. Her expression didn't change. No smile, no frown, no acknowledgement at all. But the tiniest flicker of recognition passed between us. Like a coded message, "I haven't forgotten either." That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't random. She wasn't just another stranger I happened to clash with on a plane. No, she wanted something. Influence, recognition, to remind me of my place. I didn't know yet, but I knew I wasn't going to spend the rest of this week shrinking into the background every time I saw her. The turning point came later that afternoon during one of the breakout sessions. Mark and Susan had split off to attend different panels, and I'd been assigned to represent our company at a smaller roundtable discussion about B2B partnerships. It wasn't a huge crowd, maybe 25 people in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. I walked in, scanned the room for an empty seat, and froze. She was there, not just there, positioned perfectly at the head of one of the tables, already deep in conversation with three people who were clearly hanging on her every word. She glanced up as I walked in, offered the faintest ghost of a smirk, then went right back to her conversation. For a second I considered leaving. I could have easily ducked out, found another session, spared myself the discomfort, but something inside me rebelled against the idea. I was tired of feeling like the rookie, tired of letting someone else control the narrative. So I walked in, head high, and took the empty seat directly across from her. The discussion kicked off and I forced myself to focus on the actual content. We were talking about collaborative solutions, integrating emerging APIs, and scaling infrastructure for mid-sized businesses. It was my wheelhouse, and I knew my stuff. Every time I contributed to the discussion, though, I could feel her attention shift. She didn't interrupt, but there were subtle things. The way she'd pause mid-sentence when I spoke, the slight narrowing of her eyes when someone nodded at my points, the faintly patronizing smile when I finished talking, like she was assessing me, testing me. Halfway through, the moderator asked for examples of successful cross-company collaborations. I gave a detailed example from a recent project we'd completed, one that had directly improved client retention metrics by 18% in a 6-month window. The moderator nodded thoughtfully, asking a follow-up question. Before I could answer, she cut in. "That's interesting," she said, her voice soft but carrying. "But from my experience, numbers like that are usually inflated when you don't factor in secondary churn." A couple of people glanced between us, sensing the shift. My jaw tightened. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. Not confrontational enough to be openly rude, but dismissive enough to undermine me in front of everyone. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay composed. The old me, the me from the flight, would have backed off, laughed awkwardly, maybe let it slide, but not this time. "Normally I'd agree," I said evenly, keeping my tone calm and measured. "But we've actually run a full regression analysis, factoring in secondary churn and re-engagement rates. Those numbers aren't projections, they're verified." Then I slid a printed chart across the table toward the moderator. Silent. The moderator studied the numbers, nodded and said, "That's solid work." I didn't look at her, but I felt it, the shift in energy, the subtle tightening of her posture, the faint, almost imperceptible sigh she let out before leaning back in her chair. For the first time since that stupid plane ride, the balance tipped. The rest of the session carried on, but everything had changed. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I wasn't dodging her glances, or waiting for the next passive-aggressive move. I'd stood my ground politely, professionally, without raising my voice or giving her anything to weaponize. When the session ended, I gathered my notes, stood up, and walked out without waiting to see if she'd follow. I didn't expect her to, but she did. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard her heels clicking behind me. She caught up, slipped into step beside me, and without looking at me said, "You handled yourself well in there." It wasn't a compliment, not really. It was acknowledgement, a subtle way of letting me know she'd taken notice, maybe even reassessing whatever game she thought she was playing. I didn't respond, just nodded once, polite but distant, and kept walking. That night, at the hotel bar, Mark raised his glass when I joined him, and Susan heard. "You made waves in the round table today," he said with a grin. Susan smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Told you he'd figure it out." I didn't explain the details. Didn't mention the woman. Didn't tell them how the whole thing had started on a plane, 6 hours out of Chicago. But inside something had shifted. For the first time since joining the company, I felt like I belonged. And yet, even with that small victory, even with the subtle satisfaction of standing my ground, there was one thing gnawing at me, one question I couldn't answer. Why did she choose me? Because despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling this wasn't random, that I'd somehow stumbled into the crosshairs of someone who played games for a living. And as I'd learn on the final day of the convention, I wasn't wrong. Life has a strange way of humbling you. For the longest time, I thought I understood what mattered. security, family, love, acceptance, but standing on the other side of everything I had endured, I realized how little I actually knew about myself until life forced me to start over. By the time January 2024 rolled around, things felt quieter, not peaceful exactly, just quieter, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, where you're still not sure if it's really over, but for the first time in years, the thunder isn't shaking your windows anymore. I had moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, nothing fancy, white walls, creaky hardwood floors, a tiny balcony where I could sip coffee and watch the early morning chaos unfold down below. New York had a way of making you feel both invisible and significant at the same time. I liked that. After everything with my family, I needed a place where I could exist without constant judgment, without the weight of expectations crushing me every time I walked through a door. I had cut contact with most of them after the reunion incident. It wasn't easy cutting ties with people who share your blood, never is, but every time I tried to reopen that door, the same wounds split open again. I'd scroll through old text threads, half-written apologies and explanations that I never sent, until finally I deleted them all one night. It was strange how grief didn't always come from death. Sometimes it came from letting go of the living. But here's the thing about endings. They force beginnings. I started therapy in March 2020. For the first time, I allowed myself to unpack everything I had carried for decades. The rejection, the manipulation, the resentment, the feeling of always being the outsider in my own family. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Martinez, didn't rush me. She let the silence sit when it needed to. Some days I cried until I couldn't breathe. Other days I sat there staring at the ceiling, numb, unable to form words. But piece by piece, I started understanding myself in ways I never had before. One of the biggest breakthroughs came during a session in May. I had been talking about the reunion, the looks on their faces when they saw the house, the awkward silence, the guilt in their voices when they tried to explain themselves. And then I realized something I hadn't been able to admit out loud. I wasn't angry because they excluded me. I was angry because I kept expecting them to love me the way I loved them. That realization gutted me. I kept trying to earn something that was never mine. To begin with, all those years I thought if I worked harder, achieved more, became someone they couldn't ignore, they would finally see me. But love, real love, doesn't need convincing. It doesn't keep score, and once I stopped trying to win them over, I felt lighter. In June I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I booked a one-way ticket to Lisbon, Portugal. It wasn't planned. I just woke up one morning, opened my laptop and clicked book now. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, but something inside me needed to leave to step into a place where nothing reminded me of who I used to be. Lisbon was magic. I spent the summer wandering its cobbled streets, eating pastéis de nata by the river, watching sunsets that felt like they were painted just for me. I rented a small apartment in Alfama, where old fado music floated through my window at night, and the neighbors greeted me like I'd lived there forever. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by my past. I wasn't the outsider, the disappointment, or the one who got excluded. I was just me. I kept writing too. I'd sit by the water, laptop balanced on my knees, and pour my thoughts into pages I never intended anyone to read. It was messy and unfiltered, but it was honest. That writing turned into something unexpected. A blog. I didn't advertise it, didn't share it with anyone I knew, but slowly, strangers started finding me. People left comments saying they'd felt the same way, that they too carried old wounds that wouldn't heal. Somehow through my own pain, I was helping other people heal. By September I had built a small online community. People from all over the world, India, Canada, Brazil, South Africa, sharing their stories, supporting each other, reminding me that brokenness wasn't something to be ashamed of. There was something beautiful in realizing how universal pain was. Meanwhile, back in the States, my family tried to reach out again. It started with my cousin Leah, a short text on my birthday in October. "Happy birthday, I miss you." I stared at it for hours. Old me would have replied instantly, desperate for connection, hungry for crumbs of affection, but I didn't. Not because I hated her, I didn't, but because I had finally accepted that missing someone doesn't always mean you let them back in. It took me years to understand this, but distance isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's protection. I still had my moments though. Nights when the loneliness hit hard,
when I'd scroll through social media and see photos of my siblings together, laughing, celebrating, building memories I wasn't part of. It stung, every single time. Healing isn't linear, it comes in waves. Some days you feel untouchable, and other days the grief knocks the wind out of you. But now, I let myself feel it without drowning in it. December 2024 came faster than I expected. One cold, rainy night, I sat on my balcony in Lisbon, with a glass of wine, thinking about the last 2 years, about how a family reunion broke me, and in some twisted way saved me. If that day hadn't happened, I don't know if I ever would have walked away. I don't know if I ever would have found myself. I thought about my dad a lot that night. He never called me after the reunion, not once, and yet I forgave him, not because he asked me to, but because carrying that anger was exhausting. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about letting people off the hook, it's about setting yourself free. As 2025 began, I finally felt okay, not fixed, not whole, but okay. I wake up now without that heavy pit in my stomach. I drink my coffee slowly. I take long walks. I write. I laugh again, really laugh, the kind that shakes your ribs. I've built a little chosen family here, people who see me, really see me, without conditions or expectations. Sometimes I think about going back. Sometimes I imagine walking into another reunion, years from now, standing tall, smiling, and saying I made it anyway. Maybe one day I will, or maybe I won't. The difference now is that I no longer need their approval to breathe. I've stopped living my life as a reaction to other people's choices. I'm living it for me, and maybe that's the most powerful revenge of all. Not anger, not confrontation, not even success, just peace. Because after everything, after all the chaos and heartbreak, I finally understand one thing. Sometimes the family you're born into breaks you, but the family you choose heals you, and somewhere in between you find yourself.
My coworkers thought leaving early was unfair. I let them have their way, and it backfired in the most satisfying way possible. I'd always thought of myself as a patient person, the kind who could roll with the punches and take things in stride. Maybe that's why I lasted as long as I did in the corporate world without losing my mind. My name's Anya, and back in 2014, I was in my late 20s, living in Reading, UK, though I wasn't British. I'd moved here a few years earlier for work, chasing a decent career in finance, and somehow between adjusting to the weather, the culture, and figuring out which British biscuits didn't make me gag, I'd carved out a life for myself. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, but it was comfortable, predictable, safe. I worked for a large multinational company that had this sprawling office building with multiple departments scattered across different floors. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, but in the rare moments when colleagues did talk, it was a mix of polite chatter and veiled competitiveness. We weren't the most connected team in the world, but we had a rhythm, a sense of who did what and when. I had found my place in one of the quieter departments where flexi time was common, and I'd taken advantage of it to make life a little easier. You see, I lived on the outskirts of town, and the traffic during peak hours was a nightmare. A typical journey that should have taken 30 minutes could easily stretch to an hour and a half. So after checking with my manager, I started coming in at 8 a.m. and leaving at 4 p.m., well before the bulk of the rush. It was simple enough, and for the better part of 4 years, it was never an issue. I got my work done, the phones were covered, and my colleagues seemed indifferent. That arrangement suited me perfectly. I could beat the traffic, get some extra time in the evenings, and still be fully compliant with the company's core hours, which were 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Everything changed, though, when I switched departments. It wasn't my idea initially. I was offered an internal transfer that seemed promising. The new department had a slightly higher profile, more visibility, and opportunities for growth. I figured, why not? It was still within the same company, and the idea of flexi time still existed across most teams, so I didn't anticipate any friction. From the moment I arrived, I could sense subtle tension. My new colleagues were polite enough on the surface, but there was this undercurrent, almost imperceptible, of judgment. I shrugged it off at first. New environment, new personalities. It wasn't unusual for people to take time to warm up, but the whispers started to filter through sooner than I expected. Comments about my hours, casual mentions in team meetings about how someone always leaves early, and subtle glances when I packed up my laptop at 4 p.m. It wasn't overt hostility, but there was enough for me to notice. At first, I tried to ignore it. I reminded myself that I had the right to these hours, that I wasn't hurting anyone, and that the phone coverage was perfectly adequate. But it didn't take long before my manager pulled me aside one afternoon, a few weeks into my tenure, looking tired and slightly exasperated. "They're not happy," he said, hands stuffed in his pockets. "The team, they're really complaining about you leaving at 4. I blinked. "Leaving at 4? I've been doing this for years without issue. It doesn't affect anyone," I said. "I know," he replied, running a hand down his face. "I've tried to explain that to them. I've suggested a rota, giving everyone a chance to leave early if they want. Flexible coverage, everything. Nothing sticks. They won't accept it." I felt a flicker of annoyance, but also a rush of curiosity. "So what am I supposed to do?" He sighed. "You could move to another department. There are teams where flexi time is less controversial, or," he paused, a little smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, "or maybe you could let them win for a while, just for a couple of weeks." I tilted my head, intrigued. "Let them win," he shrugged. "Let them think they've won. Just humor them for a bit while I see what I can do on my end." And that's when it clicked. I don't know why it made me smile, but it did. A plan started forming in my mind, slowly, carefully. I wasn't one to jump into petty games, but the injustice of it, the sheer absurdity of grown adults complaining about someone following the rules, they were practically handing me an opportunity. Over the next couple of weeks, I let things simmer. I didn't say much in meetings, didn't make waves. I watched my colleagues fume quietly, their little complaints bubbling up whenever there was a pause in conversation. They didn't know I was aware, didn't know that I was paying attention to every side glance and whispered comment, and I let myself enjoy that tiny sense of power, subtle and quiet, building beneath the surface. I also took stock of the office dynamics. The phones needed coverage from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., so even though my hours were different, I was technically fulfilling my duty. I remembered how in my previous department, I often handled calls before 10 a.m., quiet, focused, unnoticed. And now in this new team, I realized how much I'd been carrying those responsibilities alone, without thanks, without acknowledgement. I let a small part of myself simmer in that memory, letting it fuel a growing sense of resolve. By the end of those weeks, I had a plan. I would let them push, let them rant, let them feel justified in their grievances. And then at just the right moment, I would turn the situation on its head. But to do that, I had to wait for the perfect setup, the right opportunity to strike without looking petty or vindictive. Timing, I reminded myself, was everything. Looking back, it's funny how these things start small. A minor annoyance can fester into something larger when you're patient and observant enough to notice the cracks. And in that moment, as I sat at my desk watching my colleagues argue over the minute details of who left when, I realized that patience had become my weapon. I didn't have to yell, argue, or defend myself. I just had to wait. And I was very, very good at waiting. The tension didn't explode immediately. It built slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a storm rolling in over the horizon. Every morning, I walked into the office. I could feel it, a subtle weight pressing down on my shoulders. My colleagues didn't even need to say anything. I could see it in the way they lingered at their desks, in the faint exasperation on their faces when I packed up my laptop at 4, and in the small biting comments tossed casually into team discussions. It started with those little sighs half muttered under breath, and escalated to outright complaints to our department manager. I overheard snippets in the kitchen, in the corridor, in the faint murmur near the coffee machine. "She leaves too early, it's not fair, everyone should work the same hours." The words weren't aimed at me directly, but they were sharp enough to cut, precise enough to irritate. I tried to remind myself that it didn't matter. My work was done, the phones were covered, no one had to sacrifice anything because of me. But the frustration in the office was contagious. I noticed it creeping into my own thoughts, a subtle questioning of my choices.
Was I really being unreasonable? Was my quiet, disciplined routine somehow upsetting the natural balance of the team? Then came the fateful meeting, the one that would ignite everything. Our department manager, James, called for a discussion on working hour, a routine team meeting, he said, but with the faintest note of unease in his tone. I sat quietly, letting the murmurs and complaints wash over me, pretending to be disinterested even though every fiber of me was alert, calculating. The complaints poured out almost immediately. They were eloquent in their indignation, each person taking turns to explain why it was unfair that I left at 4 while they stayed until 5. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting them build their narrative. Their faces were flushed with self-righteousness, their voices tinged with frustration that bordered on entitlement. Every complaint, every argument only strengthened my resolve. At one point I felt a flicker of amusement. They were so wrapped up in their moral argument, so convinced of their righteousness, that they didn't notice the irony. They were arguing about fairness while ignoring the fact that their precious system had already accommodated flexibility. I let a few small comments slip here and there, innocuous enough to seem like participation, but sharp enough to poke at their egos. A word here, a phrase there, a casual observation that subtly highlighted the inconsistencies in their logic. I could see them bristle, their annoyance growing in real time, and I stifled a smile. And then came the moment. I had waited for it, watched for it, timed it with precision. Leaning back in my chair, hands resting lightly on my lap, I let the silence stretch heavy and deliberate. Everyone had exhausted themselves with their complaints, their faces red, their voices tense. I could feel the shift in the room, a subtle anticipation, and I knew it was time to act. I see, I said, calm and measured, letting the words hang in the air.
It sounds like you all think it would be fair if I worked the same hours as everyone else. That is 9 to 5? There was a pause, a moment of collective realization. Heads nodded, some more enthusiastic than others, as though I had finally seen the light and agreed to join the ranks of the righteous. My manager's eyes flickered with curiosity, perhaps a hint of amusement, and I knew he understood exactly what I was doing. Yes, I continued, leaning slightly forward, voice soft but deliberate. It seems only right that we all work the same hours, considering that my early departures have been a source of tension. A chorus of approval followed, nods, murmurs of agreement. They were pleased, satisfied, finally getting what they wanted, and then, just as they relaxed, believing the ordeal was over, I delivered the subtle twist. Then I said, letting the words land carefully, that as a team, we all work 9 to 5, starting tomorrow. The room went quiet. I could see the confusion flicker across their faces, the initial delight giving way to a dawning sense of unease. My manager, James, broke the silence with a small, encouraging smile. "That's actually a brilliant solution," he said. "It's exactly what the team has been asking for. We'll implement it immediately." I nodded, suppressing a grin, letting the weight of the moment sink in. They had won, or so they thought, but in reality the shift had turned everything upside down. Suddenly, my careful, structured schedule of 8 to 4 was obsolete. Flexibility was gone. The very thing they had demanded, the equality of hours, meant that they would now be forced to adjust their routines, confront the realities of a rigid schedule, and face the minor inconveniences they had once shrugged off. And then I added the details that made it sting just a little more. There was a worldwide sporting event happening at the time, something that for most Brits was a major distraction and source of excitement. The games were being played abroad, so some matches fell during UK mornings, and my colleagues had been taking advantage of flexi time to watch them without missing work. I reminded them, casually, that with the new 9 to 5 schedule, those early morning games would now fall during office hours. They'd no longer have the freedom to watch as they pleased. One colleague attempted to argue, to suggest a compromise, but James stepped in smoothly, reiterating that this was exactly what the team had requested, equal hours for everyone. I let them fume silently, knowing that they had engineered their own minor frustration. The final detail was the one that brought the situation full circle. Since I could no longer leave early, I no longer needed to work through my lunch break,
something I had often done to cover phone lines or ensure work was completed efficiently. This meant that the carefully orchestrated semifinals and quarterfinals of the sporting event, which they had planned to watch during lunch on the large office screen, would now be restricted to a single hour. Their smiles faltered as they realized the practical implications of their victory, and all the while my manager watched, quiet amusement in his eyes. He had known all along. I realized that this minor workplace rebellion had the potential to be educational. For them, of course. The other piece of information James had shared with me 2 weeks prior now clicked fully into place. The office was relocating as part of a cost-cutting exercise, moving to a building much closer to my home. The supposed loss of flexi time would ultimately benefit me in ways they couldn't imagine. Soon, I'd be able to walk to work, free from traffic, free from their petty complaints. The irony of the situation was delicious. I watched my colleagues as they processed it all, the loss of flexibility, the disruption of their morning routines, the limited access to games they had planned around. The looks on their faces ranged from mild annoyance to dawning horror as the consequences of their demands settled in, and I felt a quiet, almost meditative satisfaction. It wasn't just about leaving early anymore, or about flexi time. It was about principle, patience, and subtle strategy. I had let them push, let them complain, let them believe they had the upper hand, only to quietly orchestrate a reversal that exposed the minor absurdities of their insistence on fairness. And in that quiet moment, I felt an unexpected clarity. I wasn't being petty. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply observing, calculating, and responding in a way that highlighted the natural consequences of their actions. It was a lesson in patience, in timing, and in understanding the intricate dance of human behavior in a workplace environment. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my belongings, calmly, feeling the lightness of my routine restored in a new form. My colleagues exchanged muted whispers, some glancing at me with a mix of irritation and reluctant acknowledgement. My manager gave me a subtle nod, a silent recognition of the careful planning and restraint that had gone into my actions. Walking back to my desk, I realized how satisfying it was to wield patience as a weapon. Not aggression, not confrontation, just quiet observation, careful timing, and letting the universe, or in this case office politics, play its course. By the time I logged off at 5 p.m. that day, I felt a deep simmering satisfaction. The storm had passed, the landscape had shifted, and the rules had been rewritten in a subtle, precise way that left me in control of my own narrative. I wasn't leaving early anymore, but in a strange, ironic twist, I had never felt more victorious. The days that followed the team meeting were interesting, to say the least. Interesting is the polite term I'd use. Deliciously ironic is the one I preferred. I arrived the next morning, not at 8 a.m., as I had done for years, but at 9. On the quiet streets on my way to work felt almost serene compared to the usual chaos of rush hour, but that wasn't what gave me satisfaction that morning. It was the knowledge that my colleagues, the very ones who had complained about me leaving early, were now bound by the same 9-to-5 schedule. I settled into my desk with my usual efficiency, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The subtle tension that had simmered under the surface before was now replaced with a faint undercurrent of irritation. My coworkers moved with slightly more sluggish energy than usual, and I noticed glances cast my way, quick and cautious, as if they were measuring my reaction, or perhaps wondering whether I was going to gloat. I didn't, not openly at least. That was never necessary. Let them stew in their own frustration. The impact was far more satisfying when left to speak for itself. The phones rang as they always did, a steady stream of calls starting from 9, but now I was joined by colleagues who had previously enjoyed arriving later and leaning back with their coffee while I handled the early rush. Watching them fumble through the first hour of calls was almost meditative. Some were competent, some less so, and all were noticeably more hurried than they had been when they knew they had that extra hour to ease into the day. I kept my own pace, calm and methodical, answering calls efficiently while mentally noting their little mistakes, their exasperated murmurs, their stifled groans. Lunch came around, and with it the first real confrontation with their expectation. The office had a big screen in the main conference room for company-wide announcements, but it had also become a hub for watching sporting events, especially the ongoing international tournament. Previously, I had been the one covering phones, ensuring that games could be watched without disruption. I had sometimes skipped lunch or shortened it, silently sacrificing my time to accommodate others' enjoyment. But now with everyone on equal hours, that silent labor was gone. I would take a proper lunch, step away from my desk, and let them experience the same constraints they had imposed. It was subtle, but the shift was noticeable. The semifinals were scheduled during lunch, and instead of a leisurely 2-hour viewing, they had barely an hour. I could hear the quiet muttering as they realized the change wasn't just in timing, but in how it affected their routines. I offered a polite smile, internalizing the satisfaction that came from watching them reconcile with the reality of the system they had demanded. Work itself also carried new weight for them. Part of my previous flexi time had allowed me to handle tasks in the early quiet hours, clearing payments, organizing reports, and dealing with the administrative minutiae that no one wanted to touch. That extra hour before the official start of the day had been a secret weapon, a buffer that kept things running smoothly. Now with the 9 to 5 schedule, those responsibilities were distributed, or rather not distributed, left to them to manage during regular hours. I could see the subtle realization settling in as they noticed tasks that had been almost invisible before now landing squarely in their laps. It was fascinating, this subtle shift in workplace dynamic. The office had changed in small, almost imperceptible ways, but those small changes accumulated into a tangible difference. Calls took longer to handle, reports trickled in with minor delays, and the sense of urgency previously muted now hummed through the department. I observed quietly, deliberately, taking mental notes on who struggled with the new expectations and who adapted with grace. The contrast was stark, and it reminded me of just how much invisible labor I had been performing for years, unnoticed and unacknowledged. Emotionally, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and quiet vindication. There was satisfaction in seeing the consequences of their insistence on fairness, relief that my own schedule had been preserved in spirit, if not in exact hours, and vindication in the subtle acknowledgement that perhaps their perception of reality had been a little skewed. But I also felt something softer, more introspective, a realization about the fragility of workplace dynamics, about how easily minor annoyances could escalate into genuine tension, and how patience and strategy could reshape an environment without over-confrontation. The manager, James, remained a quiet observer throughout. He didn't intervene unnecessarily, allowing the situation to unfold, and occasionally offered a nod of approval, or a quiet remark in private that acknowledged my subtle orchestration. I appreciated his discretion. It would have been tempting to gloat, to explain every detail of the plan, but that would have spoiled the effect. Instead, the situation unfolded naturally, giving the team the chance to reconcile their expectations with reality on their own. Over the next few weeks, the department slowly adjusted to the new rhythm. Their early morning phone coverage, once my exclusive responsibility, became a shared burden. Meetings started promptly at 9 a.m., and lunch hours were respected but strictly timed. Colleagues who had previously relied on flexibility to manage personal distractions now had to adapt to a more structured schedule. The office felt different, more rigid in some ways, but also fairer in the sense that everyone was now bound by the same rules. Ironically, the rules they had demanded in their complaint against me. Socially, interactions shifted as well. The previous camaraderie built on shared moments of informal flexibility and quiet understanding had been replaced by a more transactional atmosphere. Colleagues were polite, but measured, interactions stripped of some of the casual warmth that had existed before. It was as though the subtle tension had left a lingering residue, a reminder of the recent upheaval. I felt no animosity toward them, only a quiet detachment, a recognition that workplace dynamics were often more about perception than reality. One morning I arrived slightly earlier than 9, purely out of habit, and noticed the reactions around me. Eyes flicked up, a few murmurs of surprise, but I simply nodded and settled into my desk. The small act of arriving early once again subtly highlighted the shift in routine, a reminder of the flexibility that had once been my own domain. It was a quiet assertion of presence, not confrontation, and it reminded me of how much power there could be in simply observing and adjusting one's own behavior without overtly challenging others. The relocation of the office, which James had mentioned weeks prior, finally came into play. The new building was closer to my home, within walking distance even during inclement weather, and I realized the irony of the situation. The loss of flexitime, which had been the root of the conflict, now seemed inconsequential. I could still maintain a semblance of convenience, now through proximity rather than scheduling. The smug satisfaction I felt at that revelation was subtle but deeply satisfying. It was a reminder that patience and foresight often yield rewards in unexpected ways. In reflecting on those weeks, I understood something fundamental about human behavior. People are often motivated by perception, by the feeling that they are being treated unfairly, even when logic and rules suggest otherwise. Small grievances can become magnified, minor annoyances can escalate into significant conflicts, and patience, strategy, and careful observation can turn even the most frustrating situations into opportunities for subtle triumphs. Emotionally, the fallout left me more attuned to these dynamics. I found myself observing not just colleagues, but friends, family, and even casual acquaintances with a keener sense of awareness. How often do small perceived slights influence behavior? How frequently do we escalate conflicts unnecessarily, without seeing the broader picture? The lessons I learned in that office, amidst the petty complaints and subtle manipulations, extended far beyond the professional realm. Yet, there was also a lingering sense of melancholy, a recognition that fairness and justice in a workplace are rarely straightforward. Even when outcomes align with principle, human emotions complicate the picture. Satisfaction can be tempered by empathy, triumph by subtle guilt, and victories by the realization that the struggle itself may have caused unseen consequences. I acknowledge this quietly, letting it shape my reflections on workplace dynamics, human behavior, and personal boundaries. Looking back, the fallout phase of that episode was less about overt conflict and more about adjustment, observation, and the subtle redistribution of responsibility. My colleagues had achieved the equality they demanded, but at the cost of convenience, routine, and, perhaps, a sense of unearned entitlement. I had maintained my own composure, preserved my well-being, and in an almost imperceptible way, reinforced the value of patience, strategy, and quiet observation. By the end of the month, the office had settled into its new rhythm. The initial frustration had faded into routine, the awkward glances had softened into polite nods, and the subtle lessons of human behavior had embedded themselves into my daily consciousness. I walked to work enjoying the early mornings without traffic, and returned home with a sense of quiet satisfaction that went beyond petty victory. I had navigated a complex social dynamic, turned perceived adversity into opportunity, and emerged with both practical benefits and emotional insight. And while the satisfaction of watching my colleagues adjust to their own demands was quietly delicious, the deeper realization was that patience, observation, and strategic thinking often yield more profound results than confrontation or overt assertion. That was the lesson I carried forward, not just in the office, but in life, that sometimes the quiet, calculated course is the most effective path, and that human behavior, with all its quirks and contradictions, can be both frustrating and fascinating when approached with awareness and insight.
As the weeks rolled on, something curious began to happen. The office, now rigidly aligned with the 9 to 5 schedule, had settled into a predictable rhythm, and yet the subtle power dynamics were quietly shifting. What I had initially thought of as a small personal victory now evolved into a broader sense of control over my own environment. The victory was no longer about leaving early or taking lunch. It was about understanding the flow of human behavior and subtly guiding it without confrontation. I began to notice patterns in my colleagues' behavior that I hadn't before. Some became more cautious in their interactions, double-checking the implications of minor decisions. Others, who had previously relied on flexi time to maneuver around personal obligations, now struggled with their routines. The office atmosphere, once buzzing with casual flexibility, was now structured, predictable, and quietly tense in a way that made small mistakes more apparent. It was fascinating to watch, almost like observing a carefully balanced ecosystem recalibrate itself after a small disruption. I decided to test the waters further. It wasn't revenge in the overt sense, it was more an experiment in human behavior. If I acted slightly differently, just a small adjustment here or there, how would they respond? The first test came in the form of the morning calls. Previously, I had covered the early shift alone, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Now I was on a team schedule, but I started arriving 5 minutes early, purely out of habit, not enough to make a difference in coverage, but just enough for the subtle effect. Colleagues began to notice the extra presence, to wonder why I was already at my desk, calm and collected, while they were still adjusting to the day. It wasn't malicious, just quietly assertive, and the effect was immediate. Next, I tackled lunch. The sporting event was still ongoing, and I noticed colleagues whispering about limited viewing time, frustrated at the constraints imposed by the uniform schedule. I began to take my lunch exactly at the midpoint of the day, not early or late, allowing the system to highlight their limitations naturally. I didn't gloat or comment, I simply adhered to my own schedule. The frustration on their faces as the clock ticked toward halftime was subtly satisfying. They had asked for equality, and now they were experiencing its implications firsthand. Work tasks also became a subtle instrument. I had previously handled payments and reports during the early quiet hours, smoothing over small inconsistency and ensuring that everything ran without a hitch. Now, with the uniform schedule, those responsibilities were distributed across the team. I began to observe how colleagues adapted or didn't adapt. Some struggled, faltered, or delayed, revealing cracks in their previously confident routine. I didn't intervene unless necessary, allowing natural consequences to unfold. The quiet observation of this, the awareness of the subtle imbalance, was an education in itself. Perhaps the most significant shift came in interpersonal dynamics. The team had initially rallied around a sense of moral victory, believing they had achieved fairness, but fairness, I realized, was not a static concept. It was lived and experienced. As the reality of the structured schedule set in, murmurs of frustration replaced satisfaction. Small complaints that had once been whispered under breath now surfaced more openly, not against me directly, but against the rigidity they had demanded. I noticed their glances, the slight tension in casual conversations, the careful wording of questions and suggestions. People were recalibrating around the new normal, and I was quietly at the center of that recalibration. It wasn't about superiority or pride. In fact, I felt no need for either. It was more about observation and subtle influence. I had learned that human behavior, when nudged just slightly, could reveal itself in ways that were both predictable and fascinating. Timing, patience, and restraint had been my tools. Now I began to see how small, deliberate choices could guide outcomes even further. There was also a personal dimension to this. The office relocation, which had been a background detail during the initial conflict, was now moving toward reality. The new building was significantly closer to my home, reducing commute time from over an hour to a 10-minute walk. The loss of flexi time now seemed almost irrelevant. The practical benefit of proximity outweighed the previous inconvenience. The sense of irony wasn't lost on me. A conflict that had initially appeared frustrating had ultimately resulted in a personal gain that felt almost serendipitous. With this shift in perspective, I began to refine my approach. I didn't need to enforce rules or assert authority. I simply needed to align my behavior with both principle and practicality, allowing the natural consequences of choices to reveal themselves. Colleagues began to anticipate my decisions, not in a fearful way, but with a subtle recognition that I was consistent, deliberate, and unflinching in my approach. They respected it even if begrudgingly, and that respect, quiet, understated, was more powerful than any confrontation could have achieved. At the same time, I started to reflect more broadly on workplace dynamics. I realized that much of the conflict had been rooted in perception, in assumptions about fairness, and in the delicate balance between personal preference and collective expectation. The team's insistence on equality had seemed justified on the surface, but it had ignored the subtle, underlying truths, the distribution of invisible labor, the accommodation of personal responsibilities, and the natural variance in individual circumstances. By allowing the consequences to unfold organically, I had exposed these truths without overt conflict. There were moments of temptation, of course.
Small urges to comment, to gloat, to make a pointed remark about the irony of their situation, but I resist. The subtlety of restraint amplified the effect far more than any overt action could have. By letting events unfold naturally, I maintained control while allowing colleagues to experience the full weight of their own demands. It was a quiet, almost philosophical approach to workplace strategy, one that required patience, awareness, and a willingness to act indirectly. I also began to notice the effects on myself. The experience had sharpened my observational skills, increased my empathy for human behavior, and reinforced the value of strategic thinking. I felt more attuned to subtle cues, more capable of anticipating consequences, and more confident in navigating complex social dynamics. The initial frustration that had sparked the conflict had transformed into a kind of intellectual satisfaction, a recognition that even in mundane environments, strategy, patience, and observation could yield profound results. By the end of the turning the tables phase, I had achieved something deeper than workplace revenge. I had created an environment where fairness, consequence, and personal accountability were aligned, not through confrontation, but through careful orchestration and subtle influence. My colleagues were experiencing the implications of their own demands, learning the value of compromise and the limits of rigid expectations, all without a single raised voice or overt argument from me. The final piece of the puzzle, the office relocation, was announced officially a few days later. Walking to the new building, the cool morning air filling my lungs, I felt a sense of liberation. The distance that had once necessitated early hours and meticulous planning was no longer a concern. I could maintain my own routines, my own efficiency, without the constant friction of traffic or the subtle tension of colleagues' complaints. The irony was complete. The very changes that had initially seemed restrictive now provided a personal benefit that far outweighed any inconvenience. Reflecting on it, I realized that the turning the tables phase had been as much about self-discovery as it was about subtle strategy. I had learned the value of patience, the power of observation, and the effectiveness of indirect influence. I had seen firsthand how human behavior responds to both perceived fairness and actual consequence, and I had navigated a complex social environment without losing composure or integrity. The sense of control, quiet yet profound, was immensely satisfying. By the time the first week in the new building arrived, the department had settled into a new rhythm. The early morning phone coverage, lunch breaks, and work responsibilities were distributed more evenly, and the subtle lessons of the previous months had embedded themselves into the collective consciousness. I had achieved a delicate balance, maintaining my own efficiency and comfort while allowing colleagues to learn the value of shared responsibility and the implications of their own demands. In the quiet moments, as I walked through the sunlit corridors of the new office, I reflected on the journey from irritation to subtle triumph. The initial conflict, sparked by minor complaints and perceived unfairness, had evolved into a profound understanding of human behavior, workplace dynamics, and personal agency. I had turned the tables not through confrontation or aggression, but through patience, observation, and deliberate strategic action. And in that reflection, I recognized a deeper truth, that true influence often lies not in overt action, but in the quiet orchestration of circumstances, the subtle guidance of outcomes, and the measured application of patience and awareness. The turning the tables phase had not been about revenge in the crude sense. It had been about understanding, influencing, and navigating the complex web of human behavior with subtlety, grace, and precision. By the time everything settled, I had come to realize something that only hindsight could make fully clear. The entire episode, from the initial complaints to the office relocation, had been a masterclass in patience, observation, and strategic action. I had started in the role quietly, diligently, always aware of my responsibilities and respectful of my colleagues' routines. I had expected harmony, and when the complaints began, I had initially felt a mix of confusion, irritation, and disbelief. How could leaving an hour early, something I had done for years without issue, be a source of contention? That disbelief had gradually transformed into strategy. Watching my colleagues push their agenda, voice their frustrations, and insist upon uniformity, I realized that confrontation was unnecessary. Instead, subtle orchestration could yield results far more satisfying and lasting. The fallout phase had been instructive. It exposed the nuances of human behavior, highlighted unseen responsibilities, and clarified the implications of rigid demands for equality. By the time the turning the tables phase arrived, I understood the environment, the players, and the subtle levers of influence. I had become not just a participant, but a quiet orchestrator, guiding events toward a resolution that was both fair and ironic. And then came the final resolution, the new office, the end of flexi time, and the personal advantages that unfolded almost serendipitously. The relocation brought me within walking distance of work, eliminating the commuting stress that had initially prompted my early arrival. What had seemed like a loss, the inability to leave early, was in fact a gain. The morning calm, the quiet walk to work, and the ability to arrive energized and composed all added a layer of satisfaction that I had not anticipated. The team, for their part, adjusted as best they could. Some adapted quickly, embracing the structured schedule with minimal complaint, while others continued to grumble softly, recognizing the subtle consequences of the system they had demanded. The sporting events, which had been a source of joy and distraction for many, were now partially constrained by the new schedule. The semifinals and quarterfinals that had once been watched leisurely during lunch were now restricted to precise viewing times, a minor inconvenience that served as a quiet reminder of the outcomes their insistence had generated. I found myself observing the social dynamics with renewed interest. Colleagues were polite, professional, and cooperative, yet there was a subtle shift in the office culture. People were more attentive to shared responsibilities, more aware of the implications of their choices, and more cautious in voicing complaints. The energy that had previously been diffused through minor irritations was now channeled into work, and the atmosphere felt both disciplined and quietly reflective. The office, once a landscape of casual flexibility, had transformed into a space where awareness, accountability, and subtle respect governed interactions. For me personally, the experience had been transformative. I had navigated conflict without over-confrontation, achieved outcomes that preserved both fairness and personal advantage, and developed a deeper understanding of human behavior in professional environments. The lessons were subtle but profound. Patience, observation, and strategic timing often yield results that brute force or direct assertion cannot. Influence, I realized, is most powerful when it operates quietly, shaping outcomes without drawing attention to itself. Even the small details, the early phone coverage I had once provided, the lunches I had shortened, and the additional administrative tasks I had managed, were now appreciated in retrospect. I had been performing invisible labor, smoothing over inefficiencies, and ensuring the team functioned optimally, without recognition. The resolution phase allowed me to step back, redistribute responsibilities, and observe how natural consequences revealed themselves. It was a lesson in the interplay between visible and invisible work, between perception and reality, and between individual initiative and collective expectation. Walking through the new office in those first days, I felt a sense of quiet triumph, not a triumph born of vindictiveness, but one of understanding. I had navigated complex social dynamics, leveraged timing and subtlety, and achieved a personal and professional equilibrium that felt deeply satisfying. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. The complaints that had initially caused stress now highlighted the strategic depth of my approach, and the very colleagues who had once criticized my schedule were now participants in a system I had carefully guided. In those quiet moments of reflection, I also considered the broader implications for life beyond the office. The experience had sharpened my perception, enhanced my patience, and reinforced the value of strategic thinking in social interaction. I understood more clearly how people respond to perceived fairness, how expectations shape behavior, and how subtle adjustments can yield disproportionate effects. These insights were applicable not just in professional environments, but in relationships, friendships, and everyday interactions. There was a particularly satisfying moment during the first week of relocation. The office had settled into its new building, and colleagues were adjusting to both the physical space and the structured schedule. A small group gathered near the coffee machine, casually discussing the morning's tasks and the upcoming sports events. I listened quietly, contributing only when necessary, noting the subtle adjustments they had made and the small frustrations they now experienced. It was a perfect encapsulation of the resolution phase, a calm equilibrium, where fairness, consequence, and subtle influence coexisted in harmony. I also found myself reflecting on the emotional journey I had undertaken. The initial irritation had been raw and personal, the complaints had felt unjust, almost absurd, but the strategic response, the patience, and the careful orchestration had transformed those feelings into a disciplined, measured approach. I had experienced frustration, amusement, satisfaction, and reflection, all intertwined in a narrative that now felt complete. The resolution was not about punishment or revenge in the crude sense. It was about guiding outcomes, observing consequences, and achieving a balance between personal well-being and professional fairness. Over time, the office dynamics continued to normalize. Colleagues became accustomed to the structured schedule, the sporting events were managed within the constraints of the new hours, and the daily rhythm of work settled into a predictable, yet productive flow. The subtle lessons of the previous months about patience, observation, and strategic influence remained embedded in my consciousness. I approached tasks with clarity, navigated social interactions with awareness, and maintained a quiet confidence in my ability to manage both responsibilities and relationships effectively. The final piece of the resolution was personal, almost poetic. Walking to work each morning, the cool air filling my lungs, I realized the irony of the situation. What had begun as a complaint about leaving early had evolved into a profound understanding of human behavior, workplace dynamics, and personal agency. The relocation had turned a perceived loss into a gain. The complaints had highlighted the subtle complexities of fairness, and my own patience had transformed frustration into insight. It was a resolution that was both practical and deeply satisfying, a testament to the power of strategic thought and quiet observation. As the months passed, I occasionally reflected on the incident with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. I had navigated a complex web of expectations, complaints, and social dynamics, achieving a personal equilibrium and professional advantage without confrontation or overt conflict. The subtle orchestration of events, the careful observation of human behavior, and the patient application of strategy had yielded outcomes far more meaningful than I had anticipated. In the end, the resolution was complete. The office functioned efficiently, colleagues had adapted to the structured schedule, and I had achieved both personal convenience and professional satisfaction. The lessons learned extended beyond the workplace, informing my approach to human interactions, decision-making, and strategic thinking. I had discovered the value of patience, the power of observation, and the effectiveness of subtle influence, a combination that would serve me well in countless situations throughout life. Walking home from the office on that first afternoon after the relocation, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The cool breeze on my face, the rhythm of my own steps, and the knowledge that I had navigated a complex social environment with subtlety and insight, all combined to create a feeling of quiet triumph. It wasn't about gloating or revenge, it was about understanding, strategy, and the satisfaction that comes from guiding outcomes in a way that is both fair and personally advantageous. Looking back on the entire episode, I realized that the phrase, "don't piss on your chips," a quirky British expression I had heard frequently in the office, perfectly encapsulated the lesson. Sometimes what seems like a minor inconvenience, a petty complaint, or an unfair expectation, is actually an opportunity to observe, reflect, and respond with subtlety and intelligence. The true reward lies not in immediate gratification, but in the careful orchestration of outcomes, the quiet observation of consequences, and the strategic application of patience and insight. By the time the dust had settled and routines had normalized, I had achieved a balance that felt complete. The office was functioning efficiently, colleagues had adapted to new expectations, and I had discovered a deeper understanding of human behavior, strategic thinking, and personal agency. The resolution phase had not been about confrontation, but about guiding outcomes, observing consequences, and achieving a quiet, enduring satisfaction. And in that quiet satisfaction, I found a sense of completion. The conflict that had begun with minor complaints about leaving early had evolved into a comprehensive understanding of patience, strategy, and subtle influence. I had navigated the complexities of human behavior, workplace dynamics, and personal convenience with grace, achieving a resolution that was both practical and emotionally rewarding. The lesson was clear: observation, patience, and strategic action often yield outcomes far more profound and lasting than direct confrontation ever could.